All right, part 4 of social psychology with your Professor Gerding. Let's do this. So, if you were called a torturer, would you be more likely to go ahead and go on with the Stanley Milgram experiment? Well, let's find out, shall we? Let's think about the Zimbardo Stanford Prison Study from 1971, and this is actually becoming a movie, not just The Experiment. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the movie The Experiment, but that's a fictional exaggeration of the actual Zimbardo Stanford Prison Study. But there's a movie, I believe, coming out soon. It depends when you're watching this. Anyway, there's another movie out there. Let me shut up and move on with the point. Here's The Experiment. 1971. 24 mentally healthy college students randomly divided into two groups. Mentally healthy, which means that they were psychologically assessed. No problems with anxiety, depression, nothing like that. They seemed totally functional, healthy individuals. Half of them were made into prison guards, and half of them were prisoners. And they even got these nifty outfits. Like, this is an actual picture. The guards got these reflective glasses, these outfits. They got little batons, that kind of thing. And the experiment was that Zimbardo transformed the Stanford psychology department basement into a mock prison with actual bars and cells, etc. And the experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And the rules were simple. Guards, you had to maintain order. You had to do a head count, which means just every hour on top of the hour, you had to make sure you counted the prisoners. And last but not least, you weren't allowed to touch the prisoners, so there were those type of rules in place. So it was only 36 hours into this experiment before the first prisoner had to be released. So what the heck happened in this experiment that made it that it only lasted 36 hours before someone had to be let go? Let's Quentin Tarantino this thing, and let me tell you the end result is that every single person involved reported some psychological trauma. Why do I emphasize every single person? Because not just the prisoners, also the guards, right? Which nowadays we call officers, but enough about that. So, everyone was upset about this. Why were they so upset? This experiment has to do with social roles. If you tell someone that they are something, they're more likely to act that way. Sigmund Freud said, "We are who other people make us to be." And think about that. If you walk into a room and everyone says, "You're the coolest, we love you," what does that do to your confidence? Boop, 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 boop. You're more confident and you're more likely to act cool, chilled, relaxed. But let's get back to reality, and you walk into a room where everyone thinks you're a loser and you're pathetic, and they even say that, "Hey loser, shut your face." That's going to ruin your confidence. It's going to make you upset. And therefore, you're more likely to act insecure and more like a loser per se. So what if someone calls you a prison guard? What does that start to do to you? What do you start to think that means? What if someone calls you a prisoner? Because the way the experiment went in my mind is that at first these college students were thinking, yeah, this will be interesting. 2 weeks and we can say we know what it's like to be a prisoner. Fast forward a couple hours, oh my goodness, this is boring. Fast forward a couple more hours, I have an idea. Let's start a mock riot. Banging cans against the bars. Attica, Attica. Start throwing maybe some toilet paper. So the guards have to maintain order. Not allowed to touch them. So what did the guards do? They did all sorts of things. First of all, they used language. Obviously, some harsh words, if you will. Some mean things were said. But then they did other things, like taking away clothing, taking away bathroom privileges. They even took away the furniture in some cells and put them in other cells. So there's these nice, really plush cells with lots of furniture, and then really horrible cells. And the amazing thing is they took the ringleaders, quote unquote ringleaders, the people they thought were instigating the trouble, and they rewarded them by giving them the nice cells. Why would they do that? Well, this is a trick that they do in the military. Maybe you've seen Full Metal Jacket, Stanley Kubrick's finest, some argue. But what they do is they punish everyone else instead of the people that are causing the problems, because then this supposedly creates a lot of resentment. This is psychological trauma right there. The other thing they did is they actually got the keys to a janitor's closet and emptied out the janitor's closet, and they actually made a hole. like an isolation chamber that they would throw other individuals in. Now, if they're not allowed to physically harm them, how did they usher them in? They got fire extinguishers to help them do that. So there's a whole bunch of abuse going on, a whole bunch of abuse in a short amount of time, and everyone involved was psychologically upset afterwards, including Zimbardo, because Zimbardo had a role in this as well. He wasn't just the experimenter, but in this experiment, he played a role. He played the role of warden, right? So this is the Zimbardo Prison Study. So the question remains, if you were called torturer, would you be more likely to go ahead and torture? If you agreed to the experiment, probably. So this is an experiment why the participant agreed to the electrocution. They were called the teacher and that they were teaching them something, and this was their job, this was their role as it was explained. Perhaps it does. And this is why in our society it's really important to go ahead and have very clear expectations of what jobs are. And it's kind of scary nowadays because if you think of what people think of police officers and what it means to be a police officer, it's kind of a scary idea because then people may be becoming more and more of this role. So this is why this is another one of these inoculation lessons. You hear a little bit of the bad so you can confront it in a healthy way. So let me talk about Sheriff Robert's cave study, right? Because the next question I have for you, let's go back to the Stanley Milgram experiment because we still haven't finished that. And I want you to imagine that it isn't just some overweight white guy that is the learner. Let's suppose it's a known enemy to you, someone you simply don't like, someone opposed to your way of life. Would you be more likely to shock them or less likely? Most people would definitely say, I'd be more likely to shock them because I know that guy and he's a jerk. You'd almost take pleasure in it. But what defines an enemy? What if I told you that we can define enemies simply by where they're standing? If they're standing on one side versus the other side, their geographical location. And for this, I'm going to tell you about Sharif's Robbers Cave study. Sharif had this idea where he was going to go ahead and he got a whole bunch of boys, 11 to 12-year-old boys for this experiment. And he took them to this Robbers Cave. The Robbers Cave was this park, basically. So think of it as like a Boy Scout park where they had cabins and field day grounds for football and things like that. But these boys were randomly divided into two groups and kept separate from one another. And then he just observed these groups and noticed that they took on characteristics of very specific social group dynamics. They had leaders, they came up with rules. And in fact, what he did is he gave them some crafts that they had to do. Like they had to come up with a name of their group, and they even had to come up with a flag. So what happened is one group, they decided to call themselves the Rattlers. Rattlers rule! Right? And the other ones, they came up with the Eagles, right? So there's the Eagles. Right? So you have these two totally different groups, and he brought them together and introduced them to each other to play some field day activities, some three-legged races, some egg tossing, that kind of thing. And how do you think these two groups of boys got along? The answer is they didn't. They were very hostile, to the point where Sharif thought, oh my goodness, this is getting problematic. I need to do something before some fat kid gets crushed by a rock. Right? That's a Lords of the Fly reference. That was Piggy. Anyway, so what is he going to do? Let me give you some examples of hostility. At one point, one of the boys' groups snuck into the other group's campsite and stole their flag. And then the next day burned it in front of them. Like, hey, Eagles, you remember this? Yeah, that's our flag. Not anymore. No, that's our flag! Right? So they were mad. Rattlers! But the Eagles didn't want to take that. I'm not sure if it was actually the Eagles that did this or the Rattlers. But they went ahead and the Eagles snuck into the other campsite and trashed it. So Sharif thought, I can't return these kids back to their families. I got to mitigate this hostility. So how did he do it? Well, he thought, maybe if I combine the groups, they'll start to get along. So he had them all eat together in the same mess hall. But did that work? Imagine what would happen. You have a group that you don't like and you're a bunch of boys, and you go ahead and you put them in a cafeteria together with food. So sure enough, food fights happened. He took them to the movie theaters together. And I feel sorry for the person who showed up to the movie that day just coincidentally. It's like, well, there's a lot of boys in here. They seem to be sitting in different sides of it. But I just really want to watch this movie. Oh, wow. There's nothing but popcorn being thrown all over the place. here I was going to enjoy a movie, but instead I'm enjoying getting pelted with free popcorn. So that's the idea of this. So how did he mitigate the hostility? Because remember, combining them. Some people would suggest, oh, well, we would just integrate the teams, the groups. Let's make an eagle, rattler, rattler, and eagle. But that would almost be murder. Because imagine you're there and you're pissed, you hate all eagles, and then suddenly an eagle one shows up and I say, hey, this is Billy. He's now one of you. You're probably going to find a replacement flag. It's going to be Billy. You're going to torture this kid. So he had to figure it out. So how did he do it? It's something known as the jigsaw puzzle classroom technique. It's the idea that you can't just bring them together. You have to give them a common goal. So here's these two different groups, actual pictures of this experiment, and they're fighting against each other, playing some friendly tug of war. But what Sharif did is he sabotaged their water supply. He made it so that the only way they could get running water was if they worked together and repaired their water supply, the piping and the water vat. And here's now all the boys having to work together to get this done in a timely fashion. And now these groups are disappearing. It's no longer like the Eagles and the Rattlers. Instead, it's the Robbers Cave Boys. They got this new identity. And you have to realize this. This is known as the Ingroup Outgroup effect. The Ingroup Outgroup effect is that we tend to look at people as us or them. The in-group is us, the out-group is them. And this creates some bias, right? Because you tend to favor those. For instance, Cleveland or Pittsburgh. Which one's better? Right? If you're a Browns fan, you're from Cleveland. Why don't you like Steelers? Maybe you have reasons, but realistically, it's like because we'll slice it up differently. What's better, Ohio or Michigan, or America versus any other country? Uh-oh, we're getting invaded. Earth versus Mars. Who's gonna win? Mars. No, Earth. Why Earth? Because we're from Earth, and that's the in-group, and we are awesome. That's the in-group. And ethnocentrism is a type of in-group bias. That's when you're slicing up the in-group and the out-groups by ethnicity. This is the idea that your race is better than any other race, simply because we're different. That's the in-group, out-group. And there's other things that happen with this. The out-group is them, but there's also prejudice versus stereotypes. And there's a difference. So what is the difference between prejudice and stereotypes? It's pretty simple. Prejudice includes hate. Stereotypes do not. They're just overgeneralizations. By definition, stereotypes are incorrect. Even though they may be historically based, they are incorrect. Now, there's a lot of negative stereotypes out there, so let me just talk about some ones that aren't so negative. If you happen to be Asian, what are you good at? A lot of people say all Asians are good at math. That's a stereotype. That's not necessarily a bad stereotype because being good at math isn't supposed to be a shameful thing. So that's a stereotype, not necessarily mean. But prejudice would be, I hate you because you're Asian. Now, these cards could be totally arbitrary. What do I mean by cards? Your club cards. For instance, I could say, you know what? If you're a Sam's Club member, I hate you. I hate you. We can be best of friends, but the moment you let me see a Sam's Club membership card slip out of your wallet, I hate you because you're a member of Sam's Club, and there's only horrible, hateful Sam's Club members, so I hate you at this point. Now, that's an exaggerated example, but that's totally the point. That card could be anything. Instead of saying Sam's Club, it could say a race. I'm white, I'm black, I'm brown, I'm whatever. It could be a religion. I'm Christian, I'm atheist, I'm Muslim, right? It could be anything. So that's the idea of prejudice versus stereotypes. Stereotypes are an overgeneralization, where prejudice, that involves hate. So that's the difference between the in-group, out-group effect. But let's finally talk about Stanley Milgram. Let's finish this conversation. 1963, what happened? What happened to Stanley Milgram? Did he get in trouble? But I haven't given you the whole story. And maybe you've even heard of this experiment before, because the reality is, Stanley Milgram's experiment wasn't actually about pain's influence on memory. The reality is, Stanley Milgram's experiment was all about obedience. Because remember Solomon Ash's experiment with a room full of Confederates? Actors paid to pretend that they're part of the participants, they're part of the experiment unknowingly, but realistically, The overweight gentleman was an actor hired by Stanley Milgram. And anytime you hit a button on this device over here, realistically, it wasn't administering a shock, it was just playing a pre-recorded voice. He wanted to see how far people would go with this device. So my question is to you, what percentage of participants do you think took it all the way